I wanted to thank the team led by Renee for organizing this event, all your effort and work for this event. And second of all, I wanted to thank all participants, especially Jose Ignacio Pinochet, the Vice Minister of Agriculture in Chile. As from 20 by 20 initiative, we have a great effort, which is to expand the agricultural agenda. We are in a regional, in an agricultural region by excellence. And so we heavily use the soil, not just with forests, but with agriculture. Emissions aren't just biomass, but also by losing soil. We are glad to have Martin Ferrulio here. He's one of the leaders on this subject. So I thank him for being here. As you know, COP26 has opened many doors to the climate change and land use subject. And so what we want to is to tap on those doors. And the new governance of greenhouse emissions has been created. The window, excuse me, for adaptation has been opened. And so we are going to tap on many financial mechanisms. And then we also have private investors' interest to invest in the region, to invest in agricultural and sustainable activities. Those who have in social, economic, cultural impact. So I want to thank all the participants that are here. And now I give the floor to Renee. Thank you very much, Walter. Let's go on with our agenda. We'll start with the welcome address from Jose Pinochet, the Vice Minister of Agriculture. He is calling from Chile. He has a great trajectory in low carbon agriculture. They have many incentives that have been successful. So, Vice Minister, please, if you would give us the keynote, the welcome speech. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Walter, Renee, and all of the participants for this event led by the World Resource Institute. I wanted to thank you on my behalf, on behalf of the ministry. We thank you for the invitation, for having this space for policy dialogue. For us, it is an honor to be able to share with you all of the advances and the challenges that we've had in our country. Of course, all of this related to low carbon agriculture. I usually tell the story that last Friday marked my 2 years as Vice Minister. And so Sebastián Piñera, the president, called me on November 26th in 2019, and he invited me to participate in his government as Vice Minister of Agriculture. I knew him from before. And so along with brilliant people and very important people, we drafted his policy, the environmental policy. So we created many programs from there. But before entering the ministry, I had 25 years of experience working in this field. So I did a little joke to the president. Are you sure that you're calling for agriculture and not the environment? And so with the vision that he usually has, he's a brilliant man, of course. He said, no, don't get me wrong. All the big challenges of agriculture today and in the following decades are environmental: climate change, wildfires, lack of water, And of course, I had never thought about it that way. And so that's why I decided to accept the role. I come from a farmer's family. I studied farming, but with the knowledge of um, the environment, I've been able to understand and to um, understand and learn more about agriculture and um, the importance that it has in feeding the world, which is what we expect to meet the food demand of the following decades. Of course, our population is growing, it's more demanding, and so agriculture needs to adapt to climate change. We need to have sustainable activities. We need to have family farming. That is key for us to have an open international market, transparent market, and hopefully without obstacles that usually come with reality. Facing climate change with our vulnerable agricultural systems in our countries, of course, it's very hard. Our country has a particular geography. The average width of our country is 60 kilometers, but um, vertically, we have over 5,000 kilometers. And so they say that we only have two cardinal points, north and south. We have 19 climates and subclimates. And so we face this challenge of adapting to climate change times 19. Of course, we make some mistakes, but we are really striving forward because this is a big challenge. There are over 1 million people that depend directly from agriculture. And so this is, of course, a big threat to farmers, their quality of lives, their livelihoods, and their own environments and communities. Adaptation to climate change has been and continues to be a great challenge for us. We are drafting a new plan to adaptation. We hope to start that program by 2023. We also face important challenges to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. What we want to do is implement more sustainable activities and practices so that we can have a low carbon agriculture. We know that of course, is the key subject of this dialogue. But we also have many sectors that have been really making efforts so that we can reduce our emissions by 2050. Of course, the agricultural sector has made great promises and is really engaged in creating new measures for strengthening our institutions and to be able to face climate change. And then we are now facing 17 goals. They are very ambitious, of course. We want to manage soil, to try to reduce waste of food. We want to improve the management of livestock so that we can try to mitigate emissions. In August of this year, so only a couple of months ago, we launched the new strategy for feeding the population. It has an 8-year program. What we want to do is to involve the private sector in sustainability activities, so that, of course, without losing an economic goal as well. So we have many initiatives so that we work together to have more sustainable feeding programs and feeding systems. I wanted to mention that the Ministry of Agriculture in Chile has a program to uh, for giving out incentives to reduce landscape degradation. Historically, we have implemented good practices, and so we're trying to update those activities and those strategies. They were about 10 years old. So from the Ministry of Agriculture, we are really working on the territory, and our farmers are very thankful for that effort and for that work. That was, of course, holding the hand of the Ministry of the Environment through through the incentive 20 by 20. Chile was successful in creating a national program to save the forests of our country, to improve the economic and social conditions of people that live near forests. This is just one of the steps that we're taking to manage the climate change. Of course, we are now facing an economic recession. It has already started in some countries, such as Chile. Of course, the pandemic has affected us all and sets this new challenge, imposes this new challenge of trying to get our economies back. But of course, taking into account the measures of environment. So in the Declaration of San Jose, Chile stated again how committed it is to the implementation of restoration of ecosystems and part of the 2030 agenda. Of course, what we want to do is to face climate change, to reduce the loss of biodiversity, and to have unsustainable activities. Yesterday, I was visiting the region of Higgins, central Chile, and they have a project of small farmers and the resilience towards climate change for them. And so we were able to see how with innovation and with technical assistance by experts and with, of course, investments, we were able to give them access to machinery or equipment. And so we see this is the start of a revolution of an agriculture that is more sustainable. And this, of course, also helps carbon sequestration. But the effort needs to come from the government mainly. Small farming has a role to play, but many of our countries don't have the means, the financial means to support them. But of course, the carbon sequestration goals that and activities that these small farmers have are great. And so we need to measure them. And so to wrap up, I just wanted to reiterate our commitment from Chile, from our country, from the Ministry of Agriculture of promoting a sustainable agriculture, one that creates food that is healthy and with activities that have a high social impact, positive impact. Of course, we are always available to share our experiences. We have made many mistakes. We have stumbled along the way because no one has all the answers. The solutions must be at a local level. They also need to be socialized and understood by the communities. That also presents challenges. We started with many difficulties, but today we have successful experiences on that regard. We have achieved understanding by the local farmers, small farmers. We were talking with the International Cooperation Chilean Agency. They have funded us. And so, but along with them, we gave out certifications. We have certified small farmers with the signature of the ministers involved. And this is a certificate of low carbon agriculturals and low carbon farmers. And so this is the way to create better lives for them, wellness for them, so that their youth can have a better future. And so, as I said, we have made some mistakes, but we have also made some advances. And so we are available for whoever is willing to listen to our experiences, our mistakes as well, but mostly what we can help, what we can do to help you not make those same mistakes. And so we're always open to have a chat, to have a dialogue. We are always trying. We haven't achieved everything that we have to achieve, but we all have to collaborate so that we can move forward. So thank you very much and have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much, Vice Minister. Thank you for sharing the efforts of Chile in this regard. And we thank you for this, for these little stories of mistakes made that are also important.
Just to continue with the program, we have 3 speakers today that will be sharing with us many of the aspects of low carbon agriculture and what is the link with the restoration agenda. I will, let me just share my screen really quickly to present you with the panelists. Maggie, just confirm, can you see my screen now?
I can see your screen.
Okay, so this dialogue, and welcome everybody from the different parts of the world. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning for some of you. We have interpretation to English, Portuguese in the channel, so just check that and you can change that to the choice you want to make. I just want to mention that this dialogue is about low carbon agriculture, policies for low carbon agriculture under landscape restoration. Just maybe some of you might know that why we are talking about restoration when we are talking about low carbon agriculture, and that's an essential part of the initiative 20 by 20 and also essential part of the landscape restoration approach. We have different commitments, as you see here. We have landscapes that have agricultural lands, and not all the restoration needs to be tree-based, no? We have agricultural crops, we need to produce food, and that's the reason why we are doing this today, to understand better, what public policies need to be in place, carbon markets, how they have to work, and also how agroecology and agroforestry can play a role too. So that's one of the things. And the other thing is, we are not, when we say low carbon agriculture, but carbon is just one component. When if we want to restore agricultural lands, we need to talk about all these benefits, which is clean water, resilience, nutrition. It's beyond, just the carbon focus. And just so you know, in landscape restoration, we talk often a lot about the tree-based restoration, but we have wetlands and we have agricultural lands here where we need to work with. We need to do things, and that's where we are going to talk with the experts that we have today. Of course, from the carbon perspective, agriculture it's a great producer of greenhouse gas emissions. I won't go into the details, but from one of the reports that we have produced in the past here at WRI, we have come up with some options, that we need to do in agricultural lands that are needed to achieve the targets, the climate targets that we have at the world. And part of that is, implementing better practices in agriculture, managing better the soils conservation, cover crops protection, basically reduce the intake of nitrogen and manage better the fertilizers. Those are the things that we need to improve to reduce emissions on that, but also to improve practices. But we also need to increase, crop yields, and we also need to increase pasture productivity, because in that way we can produce more in less amount of land, and then restore other areas with other practices that we can implement. Just so you know, we have a set of publications here that we will share in the link with you if you want to take a look at them. There are some, but there are many out there that would be interesting to look at. And today we will have three great speakers that will be with us. We will start with Martin Fraggio, then we will continue with Sofia Alarcón, and then we will end the cycle with Marie Duraisamy from WRI India. And after the three presentations, we'll have an open discussion with the questions. So put your questions in your question box, and then we will answer them after the presentation. These will be short presentations, but very targeted with these experts that I will share with you later. So with that, I would like to pass to provide the floor to the expert, our first expert of the session, which is Martin Fraggio. He's the director of Carbon Group Agroclimatic Solutions from Argentina, and with a lot of experience in agriculture in different areas. And he has also, he's an agronomist and agronomy engineering, and also he has an MBA. And he has a lot of experience, as I say, with many crops, implementing better practices in agricultural lands to reduce carbon footprint, but also to have all these other benefits. With that, Martin, I will give you the floor, and the floor is yours, and you can share with us your knowledge. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rene. I think Darren will be sharing my presentation. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the WRI, to the initiative 20 by 20, especially to you, Rene and Walter, for the work you're doing that is very important, specifically for sustainable agriculture and for the challenges that this sector has to face, and the contribution it is supposed to make to the future of humanity. So I think, going to my presentation, I think it was very interesting when you asked me, okay, what is low carbon agriculture? And that is why I would like in today's 15 minutes, more or less, to present a few ideas on how complex it is for farmers and for the ag value chains to understand, to define exactly what is expected from them from the information that is needed. Next slide, please, Darren. So how do we find ourselves today after what happened in 2015 with the Paris Accord and the Glasgow Climate Pact? And something very important happened and was presented for the first time in Paris in December 2015. And it is that lowering emissions or mitigating emissions from our activities is not enough. And humanity needs to withdraw a huge amount of CO2 that is accumulated in the atmosphere. And what was presented in Paris initially and has grown in relevance since then was initially the role of soil and plants through photosynthesis in extracting that CO2 and keeping it and storing it in the soil. And this, in general, all these practices took the name, I think, around 2016 or 2017 of nature-based solutions initially, now natural climate solutions. And I think this is a great opportunity that we'll see at the end of the presentation for sustainable agriculture, for the support this activity needs and how indispensable it is for humanity. Next slide. And going back to the Paris Accord, this is the slide that shows what is expected, right? This was done on 2015. So as you can see, the black line going up is all emissions from humanity. So the gray sector is mitigation, that is decrease in emissions from fossil fuel burning. And that green stripe going down is what's expected from nature, mainly what's expected from nature that is under production, from productive ecosystem, but also from the restoration and the adequate conservation of natural ecosystems. Next slide, please. This slide, slide actually, in the sense of a kid's game, what shows is the private sector, what the International Chamber of Commerce designed for its industries, for its members, for all the private sector participants in the world, and what should happen from now until 2050. So what we see is that energy, industry, buildings, and transport sectors have to go down to 0 emissions by 2050. But if we look down, we see in yellow and in light green 2 emitting sectors that have to do with us. That is food production and nature-based resources. What is expected from these sectors so that humanity can keep the atmosphere within the 1.5 degree increase in temperature without having overshootings and other negative effects, is that this sector has to become from an emitter, an emitting source, into a very important sequestering and long-term storage of carbon, mainly in its soils, but also in its biomass. Next slide, please. So it's evident that in order to do that, what we need to do is to calculate well and to estimate well what are emissions coming from agriculture. So I chose 5 relevant sources that I took from the internet yesterday and these last few days that show what is it that farming emits. On the upper left side, what we can see is a publication from McKinsey, very relevant for the private sector, that says that agriculture and land use emit 27% of total greenhouse gas emissions. On the upper right, we have a publication by the IPCC that says that agriculture and land use, the same sectors, emit 24%. On the bottom square, what we see is from the WRI Climate Watch initiative, and it says that agriculture and land use emit 14.8% of total anthropogenic emissions. Next slide, please. Another source that is very much used by researchers, communicators, journalists is the World in Data. And we can see there is, according to this source, agriculture and land use emit 18.4% of our of total anthropogenic emissions. And on the upright, on the right side, it's from the EPA, from the Environmental Protection Agency of the US, and it says 24%. So we went from 14% all the way to 27%. And if we read the media, well, sometimes agricultures claim to be emitting 30% or even more. And what's interesting when you find all these discrepancies, and we'll go into a few details of why this is such a big challenge and how it is that we got into this very strange situation, all of these data, all of these numbers come from one single source, that is national inventories. But this has not been very easy. So let's go to the next slide and let's check a few points about national inventories. So before we go into that, it's important to remember that agriculture emissions are different from fossil fuel burning emissions, right? And that is why doing these numbers and checking for these emissions have been so difficult. First, because all ag activities start with CO2 sequestration from the atmosphere, because that's what photosynthesis is about, and it's the cycle of life. If there would be no CO2 in the atmosphere, there would be no life as we know it, and we wouldn't be here. So when I hear people say that CO2 is a polluting gas, I get a bit concerned, because if there was no CO2, there would be no free oxygen, and we wouldn't be here breathing at all, and none of the things that we know would exist. So these emissions are different, and since they are different, they are not inherent. They're not part of the production process. It is not like a bus. When we go in a bus, we know that if the bus is moving and the engine is running, well, emissions are being generated. But if the bus stops and the engine is turned off, there are no emissions. But in the case of agriculture, more yield or more production does not necessarily mean more emissions, or even lower yields or less production does not mean more emissions. The emission factors are complex, and the emission numbers are also very complex. Therefore, this makes it very hard for farmers and agronomists to know what practices, what changes they have to do to decrease their emissions or increase the carbon in the ecosystems or sequester carbon. Of course, it's much easier when you think of sequestering carbon in trees because you can measure trees, but analyzing soil carbon is a lot more complex, and it's a lot more important for our future. And unfortunately, agriculture and agricultural value chains also are crossed by subsidies, trade barriers, and trade wars, and many other things that have to do with other regulations. And unfortunately, most of this has not helped on either side, both that receive that support or those subsidies, or those that suffer them, into designing and implementing and funding improved practices. That's why I think the 20 by 20 initiative and now the accelerator that both Walter and René are leading are such important initiatives, because they are helping people from farmers and agronomists on the ground to government officials to understand the complexity of all this and the indispensability of this sector into driving humanity into a sustainable future. Please, next slide. So as I was mentioning, national inventories and their challenge, and this is how I got involved into climate change, because as you know, the first series of national inventories were published in 1990 with the methodologies and the science that was known back then, generated by the best scientists in the world, gathered at the IPCC. But what we learned 10, 15 years later is that those methodologies that in many countries are still being used overestimate emissions in agriculture, because some emission sources that were thought to be emission sources at the beginning demonstrated to be negative or irrelevant, don't exist anymore, and some emissions factors have been reduced very significantly. For example, in the case of Argentina, which I know very well, our inventory, when the government did or used the new methodology that the IPCC had proposed in 2006, that was finally in 2017, what we understood is that in the case of agriculture, emissions had been overestimated by 100%. That is, the new methodology decreased emissions in the whole agricultural sector of Argentina by 50%, it decreased by half. And in the case of corn, I was executive director of the Argentine Corn and Sorghum Value Chain Association. Our emissions were overestimated by 173% because of those initial mistakes. But 2017 was 27 years after our first inventory. So communications and regulations and market positioning had been defined by those 27 years of communicating mistaken numbers. But then again, in 2019, the IPCC published new refined 2006 guidelines. And again, one of the most important, the second in importance, emission source in grazing cattle is decreased by 80%, or a bit more than 80%. So we find now, 31 years after the first national inventory was published and the first carbon footprints were delivered to the market or communicated to consumers, is that opposite to other greenhouse gas emissions, ag inventories and footprints have shown overestimation of emission sources and factors for over 30 years. And this has created a very difficult situations with consumers. Please, next slide. Darren, thank you. So to add on top of that, there's another challenge, that is, how do we compare gases, right? And in particular, there's a huge debate today around the IPCC scientific community on how it is that we can compare methane converted to CO2. And this is the Uruguayan national inventory. And if you can see in the bottom, I have highlighted two numbers. On the left side of this screen, the Uruguayans have calculated their national inventory using the GWP 100, Global Warming Potential 100 methodology. And on the right, they're using the GTP methodology. As you can see on the left, Uruguay emits 19,000 gigagrams of CO2, and on the right, 4,000. But when you look at emissions from the agricultural sector, and that is what can be found in the bottom line, what you can see is that emissions from agriculture become negative. That means if we only change the metric of how one gas is compared to the other, then a very high emitting source, which is agriculture, specifically emissions from livestock in Uruguay, become negative. And when you think about investments and decisions on how to change things, this becomes very relevant. Next slide, please. And that debate is actually today led by a professor. His name is Miles Allen. He's been one of the leaders in the IPCC for the last 25 years, and he's proposing the replacement of EWP with GWP star, because this will be able to support adequate decisions in investments and to differentiate, to make a clear differentiation between biogenic and fossil methane that have different movements. Next slide, please. So in order to see the farmer not just alone with his decisions and the importance that he has to the management of ecosystems, he is part of a value chain. And as you can see on the second point, communications along the value chain are critical. And the information that the consumers receive on what is sustainable and what is not is also extremely critical. And that is why today's seminar is so important about the adequate recognition and the adequate incentives that will support sustainable practices in order to decrease emissions and sequester carbon in these ecosystems. Next slide, please.
Martin.
Thank you, Rene. Okay, so now going to the final slides. And the opportunity for farmers and for humanity actually that support this community has to do with supporting natural climate solutions. These solutions can be divided and their potential analyzed in line with forest, with agriculture and grasslands, and with wetlands. I will not go into this detail, but there is great potential in all of this. And all of these, what's important is if they are applied, they will also support biodiversity, better employment, human development, and also economic activity. Next slide, please. I like this slide because what it shows is in concrete, what are the different activities and what they cost. So if farming, which is mainly based on tillage, moves from tillage to no tillage or low tillage, that instead of being a cost, it decreases cost. There is an investment needed in new machinery, but as you can see on the cost slide, those that are negative actually will increase the revenue that farmers receive. In green, we see those related to fertilization. The Chilean minister just mentioned about the importance of fertilization. One of the things that was learned during these 35 years is that chemical fertilizers have a very strong emission footprint that organic fertilizers or biologicals don't, which was the opposite to what was thought at the beginning. And so the same with many other elements that instead of having a cost, they can, after the initial investment is done, what is generated is revenue. Next slide, please. Okay, so and to end, I would like to leave these ideas for discussion. And first is that modern agricultural technology is a key component of sustainability and that supports natural climate solutions because it can transform emissions into sequestered carbon in soils and plants and keep humanity within the 1.5 degree target. Second, farmers and the members of the agricultural value chains have a huge responsibility, and they are taking the responsibility. It's not this, what I mentioned, is not saying, okay, we don't know, so we can't do anything. No, 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 there's a lot to do. And this responsibility goes beyond in trying to support global food security and also in consolidating a global financial system. I think Sophia will explain that brilliantly, as she always does. And a trading system, a commodities and food trading system that respects the needs of this sector so that it becomes more inclusive in its development, reaches its full potential in mitigation and ag emissions, and is capable of restoring ecosystem at the same time that it's sequestering the carbon that humanity needs to withdraw from the atmosphere. And in order to do this, I would like to highlight how communications and adequate incentives are totally critical. And also that, and to wrap up, that the language that is spoken today and in the future in the financial system, the global trading system, the climate change institutions, and the sustainable farming organizations must become one. And it's not this way today. There are many visions of things, and not all are not the same words, don't have the same meaning. So I think it's very important that we agree on it being science-based and work on that. So with this, I end. I'm sorry that I extended for a couple of minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Very important information. There is some questions in the chat already, and we will compile them, and then we will answer them in the panel section. To continue, we have our next presenter, which is Sofia Alarcón. She's the director for Latin America on sustainable finance at IHS Markit, where she supports the development of next generation of ESG solutions to advise corporate and financial institutions on how to disclose, manage environmental, climate-related risks. Sophia also, she has a very deep knowledge on how these voluntary carbon markets work, and also one of the best presenters I have seen explaining us these complex issues. So, Sophia, we are very grateful to have you here and connecting with the Martin presentation. The floor is yours, and you have the 15 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Rene and Maggie, for the invitation to be at this webinar. And hi to everyone, wherever you are in the world. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I have a presentation that talks about carbon markets. So the idea is to basically set the tone, set the stage around what are the carbon markets, how they are being shaped around the world, and how different markets sort of interact between each other. So it's just a snapshot of the different carbon markets. We will definitely touch upon the carbon markets at the voluntary level, because this has been a conversation in the past few weeks, but also in the past few years. So this is with the idea of giving you a flavor of how this is being shaped around the world. So I'm going to start with a definition of what is what are the types of carbon markets around the world. So let's say we have 2 or 3 carbon markets: the voluntary, the compliance, and then some authors would say the international, because the international can also touch upon the voluntary or also the compliance markets. And then we have the bilateral or multilateral finance, which is a type of climate finance or carbon market. Others call it, yes, just a carbon market. So what is a voluntary market? It's a place in which buyers, which are usually companies that emit greenhouse gases, buy credits from governments or private projects to either neutralize or offset their emissions. We have many, many examples. Compliance markets is those markets where governments regulate greenhouse gas emitters, in this case companies, by establishing either a carbon tax or an ETA. So companies have the option to either reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by allowances, in the case of an ETS, or by offsets to compensate their emissions. We have the international markets, usually regulated by the United Nations, and examples include the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, CORSIA, CDM, red credits IMO. We'll see this in detail. And then we have the bilateral or multilateral finance, which are markets that consist mainly of channeling resources from developed countries to developing countries. And this is where REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation, is placed. We have buyers around the world, such as Norway, the UK, Germany, the World Bank, via the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility and the Green Climate Fund. So we're going to get into these as we go into the presentation. We're going to start with REDD. I'm sure you are familiar with REDD, but just to give you a quick snapshot of what REDD is, it stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. And there could be 3 levels in which REDD credits could be generated. We have the national credits, usually regulated by the UN. So we have the reference line, we have some rules that the UN basically establishes so countries can actually generate credits. Then we have the statewide credits or provincial credits. These usually go into the voluntary markets, and then we have the projects that are usually generated by NGOs or for-profit companies with the purpose of offsetting greenhouse gas emissions. These are usually voluntary, but can also be integrated into the compliance markets. What is the state of the global carbon markets as of 2020? This could be a little bit outdated, but the idea of this slide is to share with you that carbon markets are very complex. We have carbon markets in NDCs, we have compliance markets, we have Article 6, we have countries that are setting up their emissions trading systems or their carbon taxes. So we see the complexity in this slide, right? All countries, except for the ones that are not illuminated in green, presented their NDCs. Some countries have actually said in their NDCs that they will design or execute, implement a carbon pricing instrument in the form of a carbon tax or an ETS. Others have said that they would keep it voluntary. So the carbon markets landscape is really complex at the global level. So a little bit about compliance markets. We have many examples around the world. I added here just a slide around the European carbon market. We have here the prices. Prices are important in carbon pricing. We'll see why. So this EU ETS, European Emissions Trading System, is the cornerstone of the European climate policy, right? And its 4th phase started in 2021, and offsets are not envisaged to be used. And these are the prices from basically the onset until 2021, and we see a spike in the price to $75.72 US. So this means that the climate policy is being effective. It means that companies are already reducing their emissions and that the allowances are being basically scarce in the market. So that's why the prices go up. In terms of international markets, we have this example of the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM. As you know, this has been the long-standing type of carbon pricing instrument. And this is just a snapshot of how many credits there are in the world. We have around 2.1 billion credits that come from China, India, Korea, Brazil, Mexico, that host around 80% of the CERS. The CERS are the unit of the Clean Development Mechanism, the emissions reductions, certified emissions reductions. And only 13% of these credits around the world are hosted in Mexico, Chile, Colombia, Argentina, Ecuador, and Peru. So 13% are in Latin America. This is a snapshot of what where REDD national programs are. So it looks like only 7 countries around the world have received payments for REDD. If we go back to the first slide, remember that this is part of the bilateral or multilateral financing that developed countries or the World Bank or even the Green Climate Fund provide to these developing countries. And you'll see in this map that the 7 countries are illuminated in orange, whereas the others say in Africa, for instance, they are preparing. They received already resources to fund their readiness activities. So that means the reference line, the greenhouse gas inventory in terms of forestry and other the safeguards. Yes, in terms of documents, they have to present these to the UNFCCC so they can start generating their credits. Voluntary markets. So this is a map that shows where the voluntary carbon offset projects are around the world. And the more green, the more projects you'll see. So we have China, India, Turkey, the US, in Latin America, of course, Brazil, well, Chile, Peru. We have some countries that have over 100 projects hosted in their own geography. So this is a good snapshot. This is the red plus at the state level. So we know that the state of Acre in Brazil was the first state around the world that published a framework to generate carbon credits, a program to generate carbon credits from RED. And then it was Mato Grosso in Brazil as well. These programs were supported by the German government in their early movers program. So there are, as of today, more states in Brazil and Indonesia, also in Mexico, that are working with these initiatives to generate carbon credits via the RED program. So what has basically held back or what has impeded the right development of these RED credits? Well, there are some guidelines at the national level that have basically hampered the successful development of RED credits. So this is changing. There are some programs and standards out there like the Tropical Forest Standard and the R3s that are sort of trying to move forward or try to jump over these obstacles to make this happen finally at the state level. So in terms of numbers, when we talk about voluntary carbon markets, we need to look at the numbers. So this is a graph that basically shows the two important things. The first one is the issuances and the retirements. Issuances mean a credit that has already gone through verification, right? So it's ready to be sold in the market. And retirement means that it has already been used to claim a reduction or an offsetting target. So this graph shows that, well, from 2005 until 2021, this is until August, there has been around 1 billion of tons issued, whereas more or less half of it has been retired. So it means that half of the issuances have been used for net zero targets, for neutralizing emissions, for offsetting purposes. And what is this equivalent to? So these are the total emissions of Gazprom in 1 year. The market is, the carbon market, at least the voluntary one, is very small. So this is another way of looking at it. These are the 10 global largest emitters of greenhouse gases. And we see some companies here, some oil and gas companies. I just used the example of Gazprom. These are the total carbon emissions of Gazprom in 1 year. Actually, Gazprom emits a little bit more, but let's use another example called India, right? These are just the emissions of one company in 1 year. This is how big the voluntary carbon market is in the world. So in terms of the volume, this shows, for instance, the difference between 2020 and 2021 in different sectors. We have forestry and land use, renewable energy, energy efficiency, of course, agriculture, waste, transport, etc. We know that the most popular carbon credits come from forestry and land use, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. And then we have very low numbers for agriculture. And this is the potential. It could be the potential, right? But when we look at the prices, it's a different picture. We'll see that in 2020, the one carbon credit coming from the agricultural sector was sold in $9.23. And in this year, these credits were sold in $1.36. Agricultural credits, as you can see in this slide, were actually they reached very good prices, $9 versus, for instance, forestry and land use, $5, $3 in industrial processes. So you see there is potential, right, for the agricultural, not only in terms of the volume, as we saw in this graph, but also in terms of the pricing. So in terms of the transactions and prices around the world, so it varies, as we can see here. We have Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, North America, and Oceania, the places in which we can account for greenhouse gas credits or carbon credits in 3 different years, 2019, 2020, and 2021. We see, for instance, that Asia has the lion's share of carbon credits. They generate the lion's share of carbon credits around the world. And then we have Latin America with 36.6 million tons. And then we have Africa. And then the other regions. In terms of prices and also credits generated by different standards, we have standards. These are the most popular. There are more, but let's say this magazine Ecosystem Marketplace only shows these 6. We know that verified carbon standard, VCS or Vera has, again, the lion's share of the credit generation around the world. It has been that since 2019, even since the carbon market started. So we have verified carbon standard, and then the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism by the UNFCCC, and the gold standard, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just an idea of who is helping. What are the most popular standards around the world? What are the market drivers? We have at least 4. Let's say the Paris Agreement. We know that around 97 out of the 186 parties to the UNFCCC mentioned carbon pricing. As we saw in one of the previous maps, there is discussion about how companies and how countries will set up the rules to either offset or sell credits around the world. And luckily, with the Article 6 was finally agreed back in Glasgow. So we are now expecting the rules from the UNFCCC in terms of Article 6. There will be various mechanisms. I won't get into the details unless there are questions, of course. Article 6.2, Article 6.4, there will be different regulations or guidance around that. We have CORSIA on aviation. This sector is looking to achieve carbon neutrality by 2020, and the demand for offsets is expected to grow between 2 and 4.5 billion credits between 2021 and 2035. Let's see if these numbers change, because these are pre-COVID-19. Maybe this changes. The maritime sector also has our goal to reduce and neutralize emissions. And this is the demand of offsets expected, 580 million offsets. And then we have corporate offsetting. So this has been ongoing since 2005, and the demand is expected to increase in the next years. Of course, it depends on the price, because at this point we saw it ranges, right, from $1 up to $9 for the agricultural carbon credits. And then, well, agricultural credits. This is just a quick snapshot on agricultural credits. So they are usually generated in the voluntary carbon markets. New Zealand is the only country in the world that actually includes agriculture in their cap and trade system. And these are the most common practices to generate credits from the agricultural sector. It's not limited to these activities, but it's usually the most popular. Cover crops, livestock grazing, crop rotation, anaerobic digesters, buffer stripes, among others. So how do they work? Basically, the activities generated on site, of course, we have sustainable practices, we have data monitoring, measurement, and long-term contracts, for instance. And then these credits, once they are ready, once the practices have been verified, right, by a third party, soil carbon, water quality, nutrients, or net greenhouse gases, then they are sold in the market. So credit buyers used them and use them actually to meet sustainability commitments. You've seen that the net zero targets have become very popular, or other companies may use them for compliance standards. So credit buyers, right, get paid. Well, pay, in this case, growers or farmers for their credits. So this is just a very simple snapshot of how these credits work, but the idea is to share, well, there are verification, there are different parties that have to work on this to generate the carbon credits. And for compliance markets, well, this is the example of New Zealand. New Zealand has a very interesting emissions matrix, as you can see here. They generate 40 million tons. Well, the lion's share of their emissions comes from the agricultural sector, and then energy and industrial processes and waste. So the government officials in that country thought about capping or sort of limiting the emissions from the agricultural sector. They're still thinking about that. It's not easy, but they designed an ETS, an emissions trading system that includes forestry and all these sectors, energy, industrial processing, biological emissions from agriculture. However, it's going to be phased in. So that means that they will gradually include more sectors, and agriculture is not included at this point of time. So at this point of time, the agricultural sector is only obliged to report greenhouse gas emissions. They don't have any obligations, not yet, to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So what's happening? They agreed with the farmers, with the agricultural sector, that by 2025, they will either integrate a carbon pricing instrument to the agricultural sector. So that means that if you sort of surpass a certain threshold on emissions, you would have to pay the government, right? Or we'll see. You would have to be, the agricultural sector would be embedded into the emissions trading system. So there was an agreement between the agricultural sector and the government. It's called the Hewaka Ekenoa. You can actually look online, and it's a webpage, and you see that this agreement was made with the purpose of designing the carbon pricing instrument with the agricultural sector. So we will know that if by 2025 they haven't reached an agreement on the carbon pricing instrument, the agricultural sector will be brought directly into the New Zealand emissions trading system. So this is a good example of how agreements between the agricultural sector, the private sector, and the public sector work. And hopefully they reach an agreement. I'm sure they will. And then the fertilizer emissions would be covered under the ETS at the importer or manufacturer level. So in other sector, not necessarily into the agricultural sector. So this is a good example.
Sophia.
My last slide. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, we are out of the time, but yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, this is the last slide. Yeah, just to recap, net zero targets require companies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as we know, and offsets will likely be required only from carbon removal type of offsets. So not all offsets may be required, because sometimes they are seen as greenwashing or as a way of not really achieving reductions. So yeah, that will be my last point. Thank you, Rene, and thank you for your attention. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sophia. Great presentation, and we will have some questions in the chat already, and we will answer some of them in live, and others you can start. We move to our next presenter, which is my colleague Marie. Marie works at WRI India, and he managed Sustainable Landscapes and Restoration Program there. She will share with us very exciting research that she has been leading on basically incentives and for scaling trees outside forests in systems in agroforestry in India. It's an important research that she has been pushing on this area and how government can help to unlock these type of activities. And Marie, the floor is yours. Please share with us your knowledge on the topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Rene. And I hope my slides are visible and I'm audible.
Yes, I see them very well.
Great, thanks. Hello, everyone. We'll be switching gears a bit from a global focus to a more national or country focus. Today, I'm happy to speak about trees outside of forest systems, particularly agroforestry in India, with a focus on opportunities, policy incentives, and barriers. I'd like to start off with a brief context. India occupies about 2.4% of the world's land mass, but supports nearly 18% of its population. Forest and agriculture are the lifelines of nearly 700 million people. Agriculture in particular is one of the largest land use and supports 70% of rural households. Indian farmers are overwhelmingly smallholders who operate less than 2 hectares of land. And agricultural land is facing increasing vulnerabilities. For instance, 114 million hectares are undergoing degradation, while 96 million hectares are facing desertification. Given these challenges, sustainable land management, particularly focus on how we grow food, how we protect and maintain forests, and how we plan land use becomes crucial. In the Indian context, trees outside of forests have immense biophysical and socioeconomic significance. Officially, the definition for this is that any tree that occurs outside of what is recorded as forest area by the government is called trees outside of forest. We did a preliminary systematic literature review that shows that over 40 different types of TOF systems exist. These include different types of agroforestry, block plantations, linear plantations, and so on. Agroforestry emerges as the most prominent type of TOF system in India, which supports manifold environmental and socio-economic benefits. The Government of India notes that agroforestry is key for increasing productivity of agricultural lands, while also improving the livelihoods of farmers. Traditional agroforestry has been a mainstay in securing food security of dependent population. It improves biodiversity, and in rain-fed areas, trees improve resilience. There is also increasing focus on agroforests to fulfill the increasing demand for timber in India. Importantly, agroforestry is seen as a key pathway for mitigating climate change. Agroforests are going to support many of India's international commitments to restoration and climate. For instance, the Bond Challenge commitment to restore 21 million hectares of land, several of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the nationally determined contribution to sequester 2.5 to 3 billion tons carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030. Agroforests are also significant as India continues with the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. We also have several domestic targets on agroforestry, including the National Mission on Sustainable Agriculture, the National Bamboo Mission, and doubling of farmer income. There is massive opportunity for agroforestry in India. WRI's Restoration Opportunity Atlas, for instance, identifies over 50 million hectares where agroforestry can be practiced in rain-fed agricultural areas. The yellow areas that you see on the map on the left are the areas where there is potential for mosaic restoration or agroforests. These can lead to multiple benefits, including fulfilling local demands for fuel, wood, fodder, and non-timber forest produce. In terms of carbon sequestration, achieving this potential can sequester nearly 900 million tons of carbon through above ground biomass alone in 20 years. Given the significance of agroforests, there are several enabling conditions that promote agroforestry as well as other trees outside of forest systems. India became the first country in 2014 to adopt a national agroforestry policy, and there is a seminal agroforestry mission that is currently underway. We have other flagship missions as well, for instance, the Green India Mission, the Green Highways Mission, Clean Air Program, and City Forests. However, the implementation experience has been uneven across India's states, and the outcomes have been suboptimal. For instance, a recent report on the progress of the Green India Mission shows that only 2.8% of the targets were achieved, and the entire scheme was grossly underfunded. As we think about scaling agroforests and other TOS systems in India, 2 points become critical. The first is to have people in the center and develop a shared understanding for planning and implementing agroforests. And the second is to harmonize efforts and unlock the potential, especially the benefits for smallholder farmers to practice agroforestry. Here, I like to speak a bit more about a research that we've been doing over the past years and which is scheduled to be published in January of next year. In this paper, we analyzed 15 national and 27 state-level policies and schemes related to agroforestry expansion in 6 states in India. Our aim was to answer 2 questions. What are the policy incentives given by these policies and schemes? And the second, what are the enabling conditions and barriers undertaken by the states? In terms of the incentives, we found that an array of incentives are being given by these policies. These include 7 monetary incentives and about 3 non-monetary incentives. Among the monetary incentives, subsidies, especially for planting material, was the most prominent one. We also had performance-based incentives wherein farmers were paid cash for depending on the survival of saplings. There were grants, particularly the ones supported by India's Agriculture Development Bank, NABARD. Credits were also available. Benefit sharing programs were also available, as was insurance and minimum support price. It was seen that many of the monetary incentives were limited to very few commercial horticulture species. In terms of non-monetary benefits, supply chain infrastructure in the form of cold storage and processing facilities for value addition were available. Regulatory incentives dealt with relaxation of permits for felling and transport of farm-grown timber. And capacity building and technical assistance was related to exposure visits, extension services, and other assistance through WhatsApp and YouTube videos. We found that several successful models and enabling conditions exist in the 6 states. For instance, there were several motivating factors, for instance, bureaucratic and political will, the interest of farmers in taking up agroforestry, and increasing devolution of governance to the Gram Panchayat or the local levels. In terms of actors and networks, we could see the prominent role played by non-government organizations, NGOs, the private sector, and research institutions in helping farmers to adopt agroforests. We also found that several innovative business models exist and entrepreneurs are taking up agroforestry. I'd like to focus a bit more on the barriers, not to be negative, but to identify areas where more work can be done and where cross-learning would be of interest. There were several economic and market barriers. For instance, both timber and non-timber products from agroforestry had poor market conditions and value chains. Economic viability of models developed by research institutions and other researchers was also poorly understood. And those certification standards are there, they are at an extremely nascent stage, and in the Indian context, the certification needs to be extended to more ecosystem services. In terms of policy and regulatory barriers, there are ambiguities in the tree felling and transit permits, especially when it comes to transit between states. Farmers pointed out that clarity of tree tenure and resource rights is essential, especially since tenant farmers need to adopt agroforestry for it to scale. Many of the farmers also indicated that the incentives promote commercial and new agroforests and do not support existing agroforest or traditional agroforestry models. This was especially pointed out by women and marginalized communities who are increasingly dependent on traditional agroforestry for food, fuel, wood, and fodder. There were also poor enabling environment around existing incentives. For instance, input subsidies, which were the most common, suffered due to poor quality of planting material, which in turn led to suboptimal outcomes. Though tree insurance is present, the premium was unviable for farmers to pay. And the lack of harmonized efforts meant that several schemes at the state level did not leverage resources from the national or the central level. Finally, on the knowledge gaps, though extension services were done, there was a need for a dedicated agroforestry extension service with a cadre that is fully equipped with knowledge about agroforests. Monitoring was also poor. There was a call for inclusive monitoring wherein local communities are involved in assessing progress of agroforestry. There was also a need for increasing participation of more NGOs, research institutions, and civil society in promoting these models. Based on our research as well as conversations that we've been hearing, we have a few suggestions for way forward. We would especially like to talk about developing restoration plans and strategies using a landscape approach to be developed at the state and district levels. Reorienting or shifting existing incentives, for instance, protecting existing trees outside of forests and promoting traditional practices become important. Improving research around traditional agroforestry models also become key. We've also noticed that the enabling environment around existing incentives can be improved. This can be done through quality control and standards for planting material, better insurance plans, extending minimum support price to more products, and so on. I will end with this just to remind everyone again, this paper will be published next month, and we're happy to share more findings in the meantime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie. Great presentation, and looking forward for this report that you say January, right?
Yes, it's Jan.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Marie. I know it's very late in India and also for our participants for India, so it's a great effort to have you here participating. And now we are gonna have a section on questions that will be moderated by my colleague and the co-leader of the Policy Acceleration, Maggie Gonzalez. Maggie will be asking questions for the panelists. So I ask the panelists, just turn on your cameras. We will make 1 or 2 questions to each. The questions that we couldn't cover here, we will answer them all, and then we will send that to your emails that are registered with the email that you use for registering. We will send that to you because we have many and we have limited time, but we will try to cover most of them. So please, Maggie, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Renee. And thank you, Martin, Sophia, and Marie for those excellent presentations. And Marie really brought it kind of full circle. You know, we started the discussion around the impact of the agricultural sector in terms of carbon emissions. Sophia walked us through, you know, ways of monetizing that carbon and reducing the emissions. And then many of the questions that we have in the chat have to do with how to finance these solutions and how to make it possible. And so Marie, with these insights on the role of the public sector, were really valuable. So as Renee said, we have many questions. We'll try to go through just a couple of them within the limited time that we have. Martin, a question that we have, I mean, there are several, but I think some of the main questions, big picture questions for you are focused on, you know, if we understand that we need the, you know, value chains to play an important role and that modern agricultural technologies are necessary, but how do we make that possible when there's limited funding and then also a lack of institutions or the capacity to monitor and evaluate? So maybe any insights on how this can be implemented, or maybe examples of countries that are making good progress on this.
Yeah, thanks, Maggie. I think what's basic is to support farmers into understanding how their production practices are linked with emissions, because that's not self-evident, right? I saw in the chat the discussions about nitrous oxide emissions that come from inefficient use of nitrogen and from the absence of capacity from humanity in all countries to return the nitrogen that we discard through our sewage, through our municipal solid waste and other residues, to take them back. Those nutrients should go back to the soils where they came from. And we know that, and that's one of the key, I think, knowledge or ideas that came from 30 years of IPCC, is that chemical fertilizers have very high emissions, but on the opposite, organic fertilizers or biologicals, initially nitrogen fixing species who are supposed to be responsible for most nitrous oxide emissions. We know now that that was wrong, but it took us 30 years to learn that. So I think that that's critical to understand that in agriculture, emissions of methane, nitrous oxide are inefficiencies that we have to work on that so that we can decrease them. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I don't know, Renee, if you'd like to ask Martin one other question or if we should move forward.
Oh, please, you can continue with Sophia and then Marie.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Sophia, thank you again for your presentation. Several questions here, and one is focused on understanding why the volumes remain as low as they are for the agricultural sector, and whether the barriers are more technical or in terms of regulations and market barriers. And then there are also some questions around pricing. And so how, so one, how the volumes are estimated, and then two, how pricing is estimated and why there's such a wide variation.
Thank you for your questions. I see there are too many questions. I hope to answer most of them. So in terms of the volumes in the agricultural sector, we see that, well, it's a function of supply and demand, right? The more demand we have, the more, right, the prices likely will go up, right? Or sometimes we've seen that there are credits that have a lot of supply, for instance, forestry credits that sort of oversees the demand. So the price usually is not that high. And historically, voluntary carbon markets have not been popular for paying a big or huge prices. We saw that in the agricultural sector in the presentation, the $9, and that was pretty uncommon. There was a huge demand for agricultural credits back in 2020, but that sort of was was very different in 2021. So in terms of volumes, the biggest challenges probably are technical or sometimes lack of knowledge. Farmers usually are not provided this knowledge on how they can generate carbon credits, which is something that probably NGOs or governments could try to tackle, and it's happening. And as more demand, or as the demand keeps growing in the international carbon markets, we will see that agricultural credits as well as other credits will also ramp up. But we need to see more demand from the private sector and from governments. And some companies were waiting for the guidance on Article 6 that was recently agreed a few weeks ago in Glasgow. So I see that the demand will likely grow in 2022 and the years to come. It may take a few years because it takes time. It takes resources. It's expensive sometimes to generate carbon credits. So farmers would have to define what's the best strategy for them, right? At the end, what we all want is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? And there are several ways to do that. Carbon credits is one, but there are others. And governments need to step in to facilitate that. Otherwise, carbon credits also depend on, there's a discussion around the quality of the carbon credits. We've seen that some carbon credits do not meet the standard requirements, right? Or do not have additionality, or they cannot prove all the requirements that are expected in the market. And that brings the price down very low, right? Because if you cannot prove the additionality or that country or that specific jurisdiction was subject to some conflict, social conflict, then the prices go down. So we need to take into account also the quality, and there are organizations around the world working around ratings or scores that would allow buyers to identify which credits are of better quality and which are not. So the prices could go up. There are also ways of driving the prices up as the agreements. We saw one in New Zealand, but that's between the public and the private sector. There are agreements between buyers and generators of credits via, for instance, the art standard on red. They agree to pay the landowner a $10 carbon credit. So that's an agreement that is signed previously to the transaction. So there are ways to do that. Other companies are just transferring directly the funds. They are not buying offsets. They are just transferring directly, saying, I'm going to protect this area. I'm going to help the farmer in my supply chain. That's called insetting. And if they do that, they agree with the farmer in the supply chain to do that, then the prices may also go up because that's an agreement between the farmer and the company. So there are ways. I mean, there is no silver bullet on carbon markets. We should be critical also of carbon markets because there was a question of net zero. I'm going to finish this, my comment on this. So net zero, there will be methodologies, actually one brought by the WRI along with other organizations. And that methodology says very explicitly that the offsets that will be used for just compensate residual emissions will come from carbon removals. So other offsets may not be as important as the carbon removals, and the agricultural sector has a possibility of generating this type of credit. So we need to take this into account before selling credits to net zero. There will be a lot of greenwashing, and this is something we should be worried about. So in order to avoid that, we need to follow the guidance that, as I mentioned, the net zero methodology brings about. And yes, so we need to also be critical about carbon markets and net zero targets. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Sophia. That's really, really helpful. So Marie, we have a few more minutes and I do have a question for you, and it's if you could share a little bit more on the methodologies of your study and how you analyze the key policy incentives, as well as key enabling conditions and barriers.
Yeah, sure. Just quickly, we adopted a mixed methods approach. We did a quantitative analysis of fund allocation, release, and utilization across the 6 states. We followed that with a systematic literature review of both the policy documents as well as peer-reviewed and gray literature on implementation experience using a set of keywords. And then we conducted key person interviews with 43 stakeholders from the 6 states. They included farmers, key government stakeholders from the Forest Department, the Agriculture Department, and the Rural Development Department. We spoke to research institutions and agriculture universities, and we also spoke to a set of entrepreneurs who've been working on agroforestry space. We combined that to produce the results. Again, I'll be happy to share more details on the chat on this.
Great, Marie, thank you so much. I think with that, we're at about time, but thank you for your thoughtful responses. I know that we didn't get to address all of the questions, but hopefully some of them in the chat were addressed, and we're happy to continue the conversations offline as well. Thank you to all of you for your excellent presentations, and I'll hand the microphone back to Renee.
Thank you, Maggie. Now, first, let me thank you, Martin, Marie, Sophia. This is grateful. You are giving us the most precious thing we have, our time and your time. And I think that's really valuable, and we all learn of your experiences. So we are grateful for that. We're grateful for the participants too, because we are in different regions in the world and you got connected to this. We will send the recordings after the presentations, today, and we will send recordings, we will send presentations, and we will also answer all the questions you made in the chat. So everything will be sent in an email that it will take probably 4 days to get into your inboxes. But if you happen not to receive that, let us know with Maggie or me, and then we can follow up on that with my colleagues here, Jerin, and we can look at that. Thank you very much also to our interpreters that are here. This is a very important task. They we're doing, and we have the different audiences here in Portuguese, Spanish, English. So thank you very much. And with that, I will close the webinar, and thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you so much and take care.